The call came on a Thursday afternoon, while Reyna was elbow-deep in spreadsheets and half-eaten takeout, and her father's number lit up the screen like a warning she hadn't learned to read yet. She almost didn't answer. She should have trusted that instinct. "Come home this weekend," her father said. "Not can you, not I miss you." Just that. A directive wrapped in the voice of a man who had never once asked permission for anything in his life. Reyna pressed her phone against her shoulder and looked at the stack of files on her desk. She was 3 weeks into her new position at Meridian Consulting, the job she had spent 2 years grinding toward, the job that had finally gotten her out of Clarksburg and into a city where people didn't know her parents' names before they knew hers. "I'm busy, Dad, this weekend," he said again. "It's important." She drove the 4 hours on Saturday morning with her windows down and the music too loud, telling herself it was nothing. A family dinner, a relative passing through. Her father had always been dramatic about these things. He called everything important, from a leaking faucet to a distant cousin's graduation. She had learned not to take the urgency at face value. But when she pulled up to the house on Carver Lane and saw her mother standing on the porch with that particular stillness, hands folded, chin slightly down, the posture Reyna associated with funerals and difficult conversations, something in her chest pulled tight. "What's going on?" Reyna asked before she even had her bag out of the car. Her mother, Cheryl, came down the porch steps and hugged her the way she hugged her at airports. Too long, too firm, like she was trying to memorize something. "Your father will explain," Cheryl said. Inside, the house smelled like pot roast and old wood, and the cedar sachets her mother tucked into every closet. Her father, Douglas, was at the kitchen table, with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a manila folder in front of him like he was about to conduct a meeting. Douglas Voss had spent 30 years as a plant manager at a paper mill outside Clarksburg, and he treated every conversation like a union negotiation, structured, deliberate, and ending exactly where he intended it to end. Reyna sat down across from him. He didn't offer her anything to drink. "I need you to meet someone," he said. She waited. "His name is Callum Hart." Douglas opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. A man, mid-30s, sitting at what looked like a formal dinner. Dark suit, strong jaw, the careful stillness of someone accustomed to being photographed. His family owns Harty Agricultural. They've been in this county for 4 generations. His grandfather and your grandfather were business partners before things went sideways between them. There's been a debt between these families for a long time. Reyna looked at the photograph. Then she looked at her father. "A debt," she repeated. Douglas took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. "I borrowed money from Randall Hart 12 years ago. A lot of money. When the mill was struggling and your sister needed surgery, and I didn't have anywhere else to turn, I've been paying it back, but..." He paused. "I haven't kept up. And Randall died last spring and now Callum has the books and he's calling in what's owed." The kitchen felt very small. "How much?" Reyna asked. Her father named the number. She sat with it for a moment. "Okay," she said slowly. "So you owe them money. We can figure that out. I can help. I've been saving. We could talk to a bank." "Callum doesn't want the money," Douglas said. Reyna went quiet. "He wants to meet you." She heard her mother shift behind her, a small sound, a held breath. "Tell me exactly what that means," Reyna said. Her father looked at the folder. "The Hart family is traditional. Callum's in a position where he needs to marry. His grandfather's will has conditions. The estate, the full inheritance. It all depends on him being married before he turns 38. He turns 38 in 7 months." Douglas finally met her eyes. "He's willing to forgive the entire debt, in exchange for an introduction. A formal one, an introduction, a courtship." "Dad, Reyna, you're asking me to date someone to pay off your debt. I'm asking you to meet him." Douglas's voice was careful, measured. "What happens after that is between you and him." She wanted to laugh. She wanted to pick up the manila folder and throw it across the kitchen. She wanted to get back in her car and drive until Clarksburg was a dot in her rearview mirror. But she looked at her mother, still standing in the doorway with her hands folded, and she saw something in Cheryl's face she had never seen there before. Not the funeral stillness. Something smaller. Shame. Her parents had carried this for 12 years. Reyna pressed her palms flat on the table. "I'll meet him," she said. "Once. That's all I'm promising." The Hardy estate was not what she expected. She had expected old money to look a certain way, grand but faded, like something that had seen better centuries. She had expected peeling columns and overgrown hedges and rooms that smelled like her grandmother's attic. Instead, the driveway wound through 3 miles of clean fencing and open pasture before the house came into view. And when it did, Reyna actually slowed the car without meaning to. It wasn't a mansion the way people used in the word loosely. It was something more specific than that. A house that had been added to and considered and cared for across generations, so that it had the weight of time without any of the neglect. Stone and white painted wood, wide porches. Lamps lit even at 4 in the afternoon because the October sky was heavy and gray. A man was standing on the bottom porch step. Not standing, she corrected herself as she pulled closer. Sitting. Callum Hart was in a wheelchair. Reyna parked the car and sat there for a moment, engine running, hands still on the wheel. Her father had not mentioned this. Not a single word. She thought about the photograph, the formal dinner, the careful angle, the way the tablecloth had covered the lower half of the frame. She thought about how a photograph could be composed to show you exactly what someone wanted you to see. She turned off the engine. She got out of the car. He was watching her with a steadiness that she would come to recognize as just the way he was. Not arrogance, not challenge. Just a man who had spent a long time being looked at and had made a decision somewhere along the way to simply let people look. "You drove yourself," he said. "I always drive myself," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I'm Callum, I know." She stopped a few feet away. "I'm Reyna, I know." He held out his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm and brief. "Thank you for coming." "I imagine this wasn't easy to agree to." "It wasn't," she said. She liked that he didn't apologize for that. He showed her around the property himself, navigating the stone paths, with the ease of someone who had mapped every slope and edge of this place from a seated position and refused to find any of it inconvenient. The stables, the equipment barn, the kitchen gardens that his grandmother had planted, and that someone still tended with enough care to keep them going. He talked about the land the way people talked about family members, with the particular mix of affection and exhaustion that came from something you hadn't chosen but couldn't imagine leaving. Reyna asked questions. She couldn't help it. She had always been that way, curious in a way that sometimes read as aggressive to people who weren't expecting it. Callum answered everything directly, without the false modesty or careful deflection she had half expected from someone with this much to protect. By the time they reached the back porch, and a woman Reyna didn't know brought out coffee without being asked, she realized she had been there for almost 2 hours. "Your father didn't tell you about the chair," Callum said. "It wasn't a question." "No, I told him he could. I've learned that people react differently when they know in advance versus when they find out in person, and I don't actually have a preference anymore. I used to think meeting in person was fairer." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Now I think it's just different." "What happened?" she asked. And then, because she hadn't asked for permission to be curious all day, "If you want to tell me, accident," he said. 6 years ago. I was on a 4-wheeler in the east pasture, and the ground gave way on a slope I'd crossed 100 times. Spinal cord injury. Incomplete. I have some function. More than people usually assume." He said it the way someone described a weather event. Something that had happened that had shaped the landscape that was now just part of what was. "I spent about a year being angry about it. Then I spent a year being clinical about it. Now I'm just here." She didn't say "I'm sorry" because it felt like the wrong currency for what he'd said. "That must have taken a while," she said. "Getting to just here. Still working on it some days," he admitted. And that small admission felt more honest than anything her father had said to her in the entire conversation that had sent her here. She drove home that evening through the dark with the music off. She went back the following weekend. She told herself it was because she wanted to be fair. One visit wasn't enough to form an opinion, and she had promised to give this a real attempt. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way the conversation had moved, or the kitchen gardens, or the way Callum had laughed when she'd argued with him about crop rotation, quick and real and surprised. She told herself a lot of things that October. By November, she had stopped pretending she needed reasons. The house came alive in ways she hadn't expected. There was a housekeeper named Greta, who had been with the Hartes for 20 years, and who treated Reyna with a wariness that slowly, stubbornly softened into something that might have been approval. There was a foreman called Pete, who managed the farm operations, and who included Reyna in conversations about the property with a matter-of-factness that made her feel, for the first time, like she belonged somewhere she hadn't grown up. And there was Callum, who was not easy to know but was worth the effort. He was particular about things. The temperature of the house, the order of his desk, the specific quiet that he needed in the mornings, before he was ready to be a person to anyone. He read voraciously, everything from agricultural journals to 19th century novels, and he had opinions about all of it that he was willing to defend at length. He could be impatient. He could be, on his worst days, remote in a way that felt like a door closing. But he was also the person who remembered, 2 weeks after she'd mentioned it in passing, that she'd had a difficult conversation with a colleague and asked how it had resolved. He was the person who noticed when she was tired before she'd admitted it to herself. He was the person who, one evening in early December, reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers and didn't say anything at all, because he'd understood that there was nothing useful to say, and that sometimes presence was the whole thing. She had been crying quietly over her sister's medical bills, which had arrived that afternoon in a thick envelope. "I can help with that," he said finally when she'd steadied. "That's not," she started. "I know it's not why you're here." His hand was still on hers. "I know the reason you came the first time. I'm not confused about that. But I'm telling you, as someone who knows what it's like when the numbers don't work, I can help, if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Because," he said, "you're the only person who's argued with me about crop rotation in 6 years, and I find that I'm not ready for you to go." She should have known the peace wouldn't hold. It was Callum's Aunt Lorraine, Douglas's sister-in-law on the Hart side, a woman Reyna had met exactly twice and had not warmed to either time, who arrived in January with the estate lawyer and the particular bright-eyed energy of someone who believed they were about to correct a very large mistake. Lorraine Hart Mercer was 63 and had her brother Randall's gift for making benevolence sound like a threat. She sat in the formal sitting room with her tea and her leather portfolio, and she looked at Reyna the way you look at a piece of furniture you're considering returning. "The will has certain provisions," Lorraine said to Callum, ignoring Reyna entirely for the first 5 minutes of the conversation. "Your grandfather was very specific about what constitutes a qualifying marriage. The woman must be of good standing. She must be someone whose family has." A pause, carefully calibrated. "Roots in the community." "Reyna's family is from Clarksburg," Callum said. His voice was even. "Her father has outstanding financial obligations to this estate," Lorraine said. "That's the relationship her family has to us." "I don't think Randall would have considered that, Lorraine." Callum set down his cup. "You don't speak for what my grandfather would have considered. He's not here. I am." Reyna didn't move. She'd learned that in these moments, the ones that wanted to make her feel small, the most devastating thing she could do was stay very still and let people reveal themselves. "She's a consultant," Lorraine continued, as though Callum hadn't spoken. "She has no connection to land, to agriculture, to the values this family." "She knows more about cover crops than you do," Callum said. Lorraine's mouth thinned. "You're 37 years old. You have 7 months. I'm trying to help you see clearly." "I see clearly," he said. "I'd like you to leave." Lorraine left. But she didn't go quietly, and she didn't go far. In the following weeks, things arrived. An email from the estate lawyer outlining concerns about the will's requirements. A visit from a cousin Reyna had never met, who spent 2 hours being warmly, pointedly curious about her background. A phone call to her mother in Clarksburg that Cheryl mentioned carefully, looking at her kitchen floor, trying to make it sound like nothing. They were trying to make her leave on her own. She found out the full shape of it on a Tuesday in February, when she drove to the estate and found Callum in his study, with the estate lawyer's letter in his hands, and something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not anger, not distance. Something that looked almost like brokenness. "They're contesting," he said. "Lorraine has filed a challenge to the will's conditions. She's arguing that the marriage, if we proceed, doesn't meet the qualifications. She's got a lawyer who's found a passage in the original document that could be interpreted to exclude someone with a financial relationship to the estate." Reyna sat down across from him. "They're saying I'm disqualified because of my father's debt." "Yes, the debt that they're forgiving. As consideration for me being here." "Yes." She understood then the elegance of the trap. If her father's debt was the reason she'd come, it was also the thing they could use to say the whole arrangement was compromised. The thing that had started this was the same thing that could end it, and leave Callum with nothing, and the estate in Lorraine's hands, and Reyna back in her apartment in the city, with 4 hours of highway between her and something she hadn't realized she needed. She looked at the letter in his hands. "I'm going to say something," she said, "and I need you to hear it before you respond." He waited. "I didn't come back here in November because of the debt. I came back because I wanted to. I stayed because I wanted to. Whatever is in that letter, whatever Lorraine thinks she has, that's the truth. And if we have to prove it in front of a lawyer, I will." Callum looked at her for a long moment. "You'd do that," he said. "I'm doing that," she said. "Tell me what we need." The hearing took 6 weeks to prepare for and 3 hours to conduct. Reyna's consulting firm gave her the time she needed. She spent evenings at Callum's kitchen table with documents and deposition notes, and she found, to her own surprise, that the process of building a case for the life she hadn't planned made that life feel more real than anything had in years. They documented everything, every visit, every conversation, receipts from the Clarksburg diner, where she'd had coffee with Callum's foreman, photographs from the kitchen garden, a letter from Greta, written in the careful cursive of someone who had been skeptical and changed her mind, describing what she had observed over 4 months of weekends. Her own statement was 6 pages. She wrote it at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday with Callum asleep down the hall and the estate quiet around her, and the kitchen lamp making a small warm circle on the table. And she was halfway through the 3rd page before she realized she was crying. Not from fear, from something closer to the feeling you had when you suddenly understood the shape of something you'd been living inside without recognizing. She had come here because her father had made a choice she hadn't been consulted about. She had stayed because she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Those two facts sat side by side like mismatched puzzle pieces that had somehow, against all logic, fit. The judge reviewed the documentation. The estate lawyer made his arguments. Lorraine sat across the room in her careful suit and watched Reyna with an expression that had started as contempt and shifted, by the end, into something more complicated. The ruling came on a Thursday. The will's conditions were met. The membership, if it proceeded, would be recognized. Callum found her afterward in the hallway outside the hearing room, and she thought she knew his face well enough now to read what was on it. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "Your aunt is not going to be pleasant about this." "My aunt has not been pleasant about anything since 1987, he said. "I've made my peace with it." She laughed, real and sudden, the way you laughed when something had been tense for so long that the release came out louder than you intended. He reached across and took her hand, and they stood there in the fluorescent hallway outside a probate courtroom, and she thought, "This is not the story I would have written for myself." She thought, "I'm glad someone else started it." They married in April, in the garden that his grandmother had planted, with the apple trees just beginning to bud, and the air still cool enough that Reyna wore a cream wool wrap over her dress that she'd found at a shop in Clarksburg and loved immediately, unreasonably, before she'd even tried it on. Her father stood in the 2nd row with Cheryl's hand in both of his, and looked like a man who understood that he owed his daughter more than he could ever repay, and was trying, at least, not to look away from that. Reyna let him see that she saw him. She also let him see that she was okay, not because the debt was forgiven. The estate had cleared it formally the month before, quiet as a line item, no ceremony, but because she had arrived somewhere she recognized as real. And the road had been her father's fault, and her own choices in roughly equal measure, and she had decided somewhere along the 6 weeks of hearings and late-night documents and kitchen table conversations that she was done, sorting out which parts were which. She walked down the garden path on her own. She'd told her father she wanted to do it that way, and he'd started to argue, and she'd looked at him with the particular patience she had developed over a winter of being told what she was and wasn't entitled to, and he'd gone quiet. Callum was at the end of the path in his chair, in a charcoal suit, with Pete standing beside him, looking like he'd been polished against his will, and Greta in the 3rd row pressing a handkerchief to her face, with the dignified distress of someone who refused to admit they were moved. He watched Reyna come toward him the same way he'd watched her get out of the car that first October afternoon. Steady, present, like she was something worth the full weight of his attention. She reached him and took his hand. "Still arguing about crop rotation?" he said quietly, under the sound of whatever music someone had decided was appropriate. "For the rest of your life," she said. 6 months later, when the year-end reports came in and the estate's general counsel was transitioning out, Callum asked her if she wanted to take on the operational consulting role full-time. Properly, with a contract, with a seat at the table where decisions were made. She thought about her apartment in the city, the spreadsheets, the 4-hour drive on a Saturday morning towards something she hadn't seen coming. Yes, she said, she meant all of it.